The mocking begins. Catherine Mitchell settled into her first-class seat, adjusting her gray penguin sweatshirt as she opened her well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. At 40, she preferred comfort over fashion, especially during flights, her one secret anxiety that even her husband Robert didn't fully understand. The auburn-haired woman had deliberately boarded early, hoping to avoid the usual parade of business travelers. Flight attendant Melissa recognized her with a subtle nod, maintaining the professional discretion Catherine valued above all else. Privacy, Melissa, she had reminded the crew years ago. Just treat me like any other passenger. As the first-class cabin filled with tailored suits and designer attire, Catherine lost herself in Jane Austen's familiar words. The conversations around her buzzed with talk of million-dollar deals and Hampton summer homes, the typical chatter of the Chicago-New York corridor. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Catherine looked up into the face of a silver-haired man in his late 50s. His suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the cabin lights like a beacon of wealth. "I don't think so," Catherine replied softly, checking her boarding pass. 13A, that's what I have. Walter Kingsley glanced at her ticket with barely concealed contempt, then at his own. "My mistake. 13B, I'm next to you." His eyes lingered on her penguin sweatshirt with undisguised judgment as he settled into his seat, shifting uncomfortably as if her casual clothing might contaminate his expensive attire. "Walter Kingsley, Kingsley Financial," he said, extending a manicured hand. "Catherine," she replied with a polite smile, offering no last name or company affiliation. "First time in first class?" Walter asked, a smirk playing at his mouth. "No, I fly quite regularly." "Well, most people dress for the experience," he gestured to her attire. "You know, out of respect." Across the aisle, a younger businessman caught Walter's eye and snorted quietly. "Some people just get lucky with upgrades," James Peterson said loud enough for Catherine to hear. "The airlines are practically giving away first class these days." Catherine simply smiled and returned to her book. Her mother had taught her the grace of silence in the face of rudeness. Besides, she had Mr. Darcy's adventures to follow, far more engaging than the limited imaginations of men like Walter Kingsley. The assumptions deepen. As Atlantic Skyways Flight 207 settled into its cruise altitude, the first-class cabin buzzed with conversations about quarterly projections and market predictions. Catherine remained absorbed in her novel, content in her quiet bubble. "What do you do, Catherine?" Walter asked, his tone suggesting boredom rather than genuine interest. "I'm in philanthropy," she answered truthfully, though it wasn't the complete truth. She did oversee the Mitchell Foundation's charitable activities, but that was just one small part of her life. Ah, Walter's interest visibly waned. One of those nonprofits. Saving whales, feeding the poor. His dismissive wave encompassed all worthy causes with casual contempt. "Something like that," Catherine smiled, pointing to her sweatshirt. "Though penguins are my particular favorite." James Peterson leaned in from across the aisle. "Sounds like a hobby more than a career." "Some of us work for a living," Walter added, the two men sharing a knowing chuckle. Behind them, conversations drifted about Atlantic Skyways' incredible turnaround. "Robert Mitchell is a genius," one executive said. "Took a failing airline and made it the gold standard in just 5 years." Catherine smiled into her book, thinking of her husband's 18-hour days and genuine passion for transforming air travel. When meal service began, Walter made a show of his importance. "Steak, medium rare, and I'll have a Scotch neat." "You do have Macallan 18, don't you?" "I won't accept anything less." His tone was pompous and demanding. "Of course, sir," Melissa replied with professional grace. As she moved away, Walter leaned toward James. "That's how you handle staff. They need to know who's in charge." "Exactly," James nodded. "First class is a statement. If you can't afford the lifestyle, stay in economy where you belong." Catherine sipped her water quietly, her eyes still on her book. 15 years of marriage to Robert had taught her that certain people only recognized worth when it came with dollar signs and titles. These men had no idea she helped manage a $300 million foundation endowment, directing funds to causes that actually changed lives. The turbulence hit suddenly, and Catherine gripped her armrests, her one flying fear surfacing despite the familiar surroundings. "Afraid of flying?" Walter asked, noticing her white knuckles. "A little," she admitted. "Shouldn't have splurged on first class then," he remarked callously. "Economy would have been just as turbulent but cheaper." The conversation turns personal. As the flight smoothed out, the businessmen's conversation grew more animated and personal. Catherine tried to focus on her book, but their voices carried clearly across the cabin. "So tell me, Catherine," Walter said, cutting into his second steak after sending the first back, "how does someone in philanthropy afford first class? Rich boyfriend, husband, or did you just get lucky with an upgrade?" Before Catherine could respond, Trevor, a younger executive who had joined their conversation, lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Speaking of rich husbands, what I wouldn't give to meet Robert Mitchell's wife. Catherine Mitchell, have you seen her?" Catherine's grip tightened imperceptibly on her book. "Former model, I heard," James added. "Manages their foundation now. Worth billions. Talk about marrying the golden ticket." "Smart woman," Walter chuckled. "Though I heard she had her own money before, some fashion design business she sold for millions." "Still," Trevor continued, "going from businesswoman to trophy wife of an airline mogul. Not a bad upgrade." Diana Winters, a sharp executive seated behind Walter, cleared her throat loudly. She had been studying Catherine throughout the flight with growing recognition, but had caught Catherine's subtle head shake earlier when she'd almost spoken up. "You know," Diana interjected, "sometimes the most interesting people are the ones who don't feel the need to announce their importance." Walter turned, irritated by the interruption. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing at all," Diana replied with a knowing smile, settling back in her seat. Meanwhile, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Robert, landing in 20 minutes. "Can't wait to see you. The car will be waiting." She smiled softly and typed back, looking forward to being home. On a first-name basis with the flight attendants, Walter had noticed when Melissa brought Catherine her chamomile tea. "You must fly this route often." "Quite regularly," Catherine confirmed. "Must be nice, having someone else pay for your tickets," Walter said with a smirk. Catherine just smiled and returned to her book. She thought about Robert waiting for her at JFK, despite her insistence that she could take a cab. "The CEO of Atlantic Skyways can't have his wife taking cabs," he always joked. "It's bad for business." What these men didn't know was that she could buy and sell most of them without touching Robert's money. Her fashion design business had been more successful than they realized, and her investments had grown substantially over the years. But more importantly, she and Robert had built something together, a partnership that went far beyond money. The landing and recognition. As the plane began its descent into JFK, Captain Reynolds' voice crackled over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." Catherine closed her book and gazed out the window at the familiar New York skyline. The lights twinkled below like scattered diamonds, and she felt the familiar warmth of coming home. "Well, Catherine," Walter said, securing his laptop, "it's been interesting. Maybe next time you'll dress appropriately for first class." "I'll keep that in mind," Catherine replied graciously. As the plane touched down smoothly, passengers began gathering their belongings. Catherine remained seated, as was her habit, letting the rush of business travelers hurry past her. Walter, James, and Trevor were among the first to stand, eager to deplane and get to their important meetings. "Excuse me, Mrs. Mitchell," Melissa approached quietly. "Your husband asked me to let you know he's waiting at the gate." Walter, who was reaching for his carry-on, froze mid-motion. "Mitchell," he repeated slowly. Catherine smiled at Melissa. "Thank you. Please tell Captain Reynolds it was another excellent flight. Mrs. Mitchell, Diana Winters stood up with a grin. It was truly a pleasure sharing this flight with you. Your discretion is admirable, but I think your secret is about to be out. The color drained from Walter's face as the pieces clicked into place. Catherine Mitchell? As in Robert Mitchell? Atlantic Skyways? That would be me, Catherine said simply, standing to retrieve her small carry-on from the overhead compartment. James and Trevor had stopped dead in their tracks, staring in horror as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. The woman they'd been mocking for the past 2 hours wasn't just anyone, she was the wife of the man who owned the very airline they were flying on. Oh God, Trevor whispered. We were talking about you. Right in front of you. Yes, you were, Catherine replied calmly. And I must say, your opinions about my marriage were particularly creative. Walter's expensive suit suddenly felt like it was strangling him. Mrs. Mitchell, we didn't know. Of course you didn't, Catherine said, shouldering her bag. That was rather the point. I prefer traveling without the fuss. It gives me a chance to see how people really behave when they think no one important is watching. The three men stood frozen as other passengers moved around them toward the exit. Their faces had gone from confident to mortified in a matter of seconds. The ultimate revelation. Catherine walked calmly toward the exit, leaving the three businessmen standing in stunned silence. As she reached the jetway, she could hear Walter frantically whispering to his companions about damage control and business relationships. At the gate, Robert Mitchell stood waiting with a warm smile that lit up his face the moment he saw his wife. At 45, he still looked like the determined entrepreneur who had revolutionized the airline industry, but his eyes softened whenever Catherine appeared. How was the flight, sweetheart? He asked, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. Educational, Catherine replied with a knowing smile. Behind them, Walter, James, and Trevor emerged from the jetway, their faces pale as they witnessed the reunion. Robert Mitchell, the billionaire CEO they'd been discussing throughout the flight, was kissing the woman in the penguin sweatshirt they'd spent 2 hours belittling. Robert, Catherine said, loud enough for the men to hear, I think you should know that some of your first-class passengers had very interesting opinions about our marriage. They seem to think I married you for your money. Robert chuckled, his arm still around Catherine's waist. Did you tell them you turned down my first 3 proposals because you thought I was after your money? Walter stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Mitchell, sir, I'm Walter Kingsley from Kingsley Financial. There's been a misunderstanding. Robert's expression grew cold as he recognized the desperation in Walter's voice. I don't believe we have any business together, Mr. Kingsley. And based on what my wife just told me, I can't imagine we ever will. Sir, please, James tried to interject. We didn't know who she was. Exactly, Robert replied sharply. You didn't know, so you felt free to be disrespectful. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Catherine squeezed her husband's hand gently. It's all right, Robert. They taught me something valuable today. What's that? He asked, his voice softening as he looked at her. That the penguin sweatshirt is an excellent filter. It helps me identify people who judge others by their appearance rather than their character. As they walked away toward the exit, Catherine called back to Melissa, who was supervising the gate area. Please make sure Captain Reynolds knows the flight was perfect as always. And Melissa? Thank you for the discretion. Walter, James, and Trevor watched helplessly as the couple disappeared into the crowd. They had spent 2 hours mocking a woman worth more than all of them combined, married to a man who could make or break their careers with a single phone call. Diana Winters passed by them on her way out, pausing just long enough to say, Gentlemen, I believe you just learned why it's never wise to judge a book by its cover. Or in this case, a billionaire by her penguin sweatshirt. As Catherine and Robert walked through JFK Airport, she snuggled closer to her husband. I love you, you know, she said simply. Even without the money, he teased. Especially without the money. Though I have to admit, owning the airline does make traveling more interesting. They laughed together as they headed home, leaving behind 3 humble businessmen who would never forget the day they learned the most expensive lesson of their careers: respect costs nothing, but disrespect can cost everything. The end.